Captain's log. Arthur Vance. Recording.
The Manticore is currently drifting through a completely uncharted and desolate sector of the outer system, a region of deep space that feels fundamentally hostile to any form of biological human existence. My primary life support systems are failing at a deeply alarming rate, forcing me to continually reroute vital auxiliary power from the weapons array just to keep the atmospheric scrubbers operational. The creeping, unnatural frost has entirely overtaken the primary observation deck, slowly transforming the heavy, reinforced titanium bulkheads into a shimmering, terrifying tomb of solid, impenetrable ice. I am completely surrounded by an absolute crushing silence, a heavy, suffocating emptiness that constantly presses against the fragile hull of the ship and actively threatens to crush the remaining fragments of my sanity. For the past 48 grueling hours, I have been desperately scanning the dead communication frequencies, frantically hoping to intercept any fragmented broadcasts from the resistance networks scattered across the burning ruins of Earth. But the standard civilian communication channels are entirely saturated with the sickening, artificial angelic choirs of the Blue Beam network, endlessly looping their deeply hypnotic, false promises of divine salvation. I desperately needed to bypass their massive global interference, so I completely recalibrated the deep space telemetry sensors, physically pushing the delicate receivers far beyond their intended safe design specifications. I slowly aimed the primary communication dish away from our burning home world, intentionally pointing the receiver toward the cold, empty, and absolutely silent darkness of the distant Cooper Belt. I was desperately searching for a clean analog signal, a hidden, surviving military outpost, or perhaps just the comforting, mindless static of ancient dead stars. But what I found instead was a cosmic anomaly that completely defies all logical explanation. The Manticore suddenly intercepted a highly compressed, incredibly dense data stream, broadcasting continuously from the fragmented floating remains of an ancient, highly classified orbital satellite. This bizarre transmission was absolutely not of standard human origin, and it completely lacked the polished, highly synthetic digital signature of the shadow government's heavily encrypted communication protocols. The signal was raw, violent, and deeply erratic, pulsing aggressively through my audio monitors, with a heavy, rhythmic thumping that sounded horrifyingly similar to the agonizing beats of a massive, dying cosmic heartbeat. It was actively utilizing a completely dead, restricted band of the electromagnetic spectrum, a specific frequency that modern theoretical physics officially abandoned as useless nearly 60 years ago.
The Enoch Protocol.
I quickly routed the terrifying transmission directly through the ship's primary linguistic decryption matrix, desperately hoping the advanced artificial intelligence could somehow isolate a recognizable human pattern within the chaotic, deafening noise. The main engineering console violently flickered as the central processor struggled under the immense, crushing weight of the incoming data, the internal cooling fans screaming in loud protest as the core temperature spiked to critical levels. When the decryption software finally managed to lock on to the dominant signal and began translating the raw audio frequencies into readable plain text on my primary monitor, the blood in my veins instantly ran freezing cold. The machine was not translating standard military coordinates, encrypted emergency distress calls, or the mundane panic chatter of a lost civilian transport vessel trying to navigate the apocalypse. It was actively decoding an ancient, deeply complex dialect of Aramaic, frantically cross-referencing the bizarre phonetic structure with forgotten, forbidden religious texts stored deep within the historical archives of the central computer. Line by agonizing line, the glowing green text slowly scrolled across the cracked, frost-covered glass of my monitor, translating a terrifying message that was absolutely never meant to be intercepted or comprehended by a fragile human mind. The intercepted broadcast proudly identified itself as the Enoch Protocol, a specific ancient term that immediately triggered a profound, suffocating sense of existential dread deep within my exhausted, heavy soul. I instantly recognized the ancient words from my terrifying time investigating the heavily classified occult archives of Black Site Station 6751, long before the entire frozen facility was completely consumed by the engineered genetic nightmare. These scrolling words were not just beautiful religious metaphors or poetic, highly exaggerated descriptions of early human mythology, designed to simply frighten disobedient children in the ancient world. They were literal, highly detailed, and completely factual historical records, documenting a devastating, ancient cosmic invasion that nearly eradicated all organic life during the dawn of our civilization. The text explicitly described the terrifying descent of the Watchers, the ancient, incredibly powerful beings who deliberately abandoned their designated celestial stations in the deep void to unnaturally merge with the fragile inhabitants of Earth. But this intercepted, heavily corrupted transmission was not simply reciting a dead, forgotten history lesson from thousands of years ago. It was actively broadcasting a live, real-time warning to the entire solar system. The ancient, terrifying language was being spoken entirely in the present tense, declaring with absolute, uncompromising authority that the fragile boundary between our physical, three-dimensional reality and the endless, dark void was actively collapsing. The glowing green text on the primary tactical monitor continued. The Watchers, the fallen, deeply malevolent architects of human suffering, were absolutely no longer safely confined to the dusty, decaying pages of forbidden religious texts or the psychological nightmares of our primitive, superstitious ancestors. According to the deeply terrifying data decrypted from the Enoch Protocol, the artificial, globally synchronized tribulation currently being orchestrated by the shadow government down on the surface of Earth was merely a necessary, blood-soaked ritual. It was a highly specific, mathematically perfect global sacrifice designed solely to significantly weaken the invisible, multidimensional fabric of our physical reality and completely shatter the protective energetic barriers of our world. The massive, perfectly synchronized detonation of the dirty nuclear bombs, the artificial weaponized earthquakes, and the sheer, unimaginable volume of global human terror had successfully thinned the delicate veil separating our universe from the absolute darkness. As I sat paralyzed in the pilot's chair, reading the horrifying translation, the Manticore's deep space proximity alarm suddenly and violently shattered the heavy silence of the freezing command module, blaring with a frantic, piercing intensity. The long-range spatial distortion sensors, highly sensitive instruments specifically designed to detect the subtle, harmless gravitational ripples of passing comets and small asteroids, were completely overloading with impossible, off-the-chart readings. I immediately shifted all of my remaining auxiliary reactor power directly to the external optical arrays, desperately trying to get a clear visual confirmation of whatever massive approaching object was triggering the collision warnings. Through the thick, heavy, frost-covered glass of the main viewport, I stared out into the absolute pitch-black void of Sector 4, fully expecting to see a rogue, uncharted comet or a hidden, heavily armed military dreadnought approaching my position. Instead, I witnessed something that completely and permanently broke my fundamental understanding of physics, a terrifying, impossible cosmic event that absolutely no biological human eye was ever meant to perceive and survive with its sanity intact. The absolute profound darkness of deep space was literally tearing open before my eyes, ripping apart at the invisible seams like a fragile piece of black canvas, violently and aggressively slashed by a massive, unseen blade. Massive, jagged fissures of blinding, sickly violet light were violently spreading across the distant starfield, heavily resembling a terrifying network of glowing infected, pulsating veins pushing violently against the pure emptiness of the universe. These spectacular anomalies were absolutely not natural, stable wormholes or naturally occurring gravitational phenomena. They were aggressive, bleeding, open wounds in the very fundamental fabric of space and time. They were actively bleeding raw, unfiltered, equally destructive, multidimensional energy directly into our physical reality, creating massive, localized gravity wells that violently distorted the light of the surrounding stars. I watched in absolute paralyzed, breathless horror as the jagged edges of these massive cosmic tears began to slowly peel backward, revealing a churning, chaotic, and terrifying abyss of impossible geometric shapes and maddening, unspeakable colors. The sheer, unbelievable scale of these spatial ruptures was entirely incomprehensible to the human mind, massive enough to effortlessly swallow the entire planet Earth whole without leaving a single, microscopic trace of our entire civilization behind. The intercepted broadcast of the Enoch Protocol was perfectly, flawlessly aligning with the visual nightmare currently unfolding directly outside my reinforced window, confirming the absolute worst, most deeply buried fears of humanity. The translated text explicitly and clearly stated that 200 of the principal watchers had historically sworn a binding, unbreakable, and deeply dark oath upon the summit of Mount Hermon, pledging to descend and forever corrupt the human bloodline. But the physical Mount Hermon of our ancient earthly history was just a simplistic, geographical metaphor, a primitive representation of a much larger, infinitely more terrifying, and completely inescapable cosmic entry point. The true summit, the actual, literal threshold where the ancient, fallen entities gather in the absolute darkness before crossing over into our fragile physical domain, was the very tier in space-time currently expanding rapidly in front of my dying ship. They are finally returning to our solar system, not as metaphorical, psychological demons or abstract spiritual concepts, but as towering physical monstrosities constructed entirely of dark matter, an ancient, pure, malevolent consciousness. The Manticore violently shuddered and groaned as a massive, invisible wave of displaced gravitational energy violently washed over the hull, throwing me heavily against the primary control console and brutally knocking the breath from my freezing lungs. My exhausted mind desperately tried to reject the impossible, terrifying reality of the situation, frantically trying to write it all off as a severe, oxygen-deprived hallucination brought on by the failing atmospheric scrubbers and prolonged isolation. But the painful, metallic groaning of the ship's buckling bulkheads and the terrifying, beautiful violet light currently flooding the freezing command module provided absolute, undeniable, and fatal proof that the final apocalypse is completely real. I desperately dragged my bruised, completely exhausted body back into the primary pilot's chair, my violently trembling hands leaving long, dark smear marks of fresh blood across the thick, frost-covered glass of the main tactical displays. I frantically redirected a significant portion of the external optical sensors away from the terrifying, expanding violet tears in deep space, pointing the high-resolution tracking cameras back toward the fragile, burning blue marble of Earth. I desperately needed to see if the surviving human population, completely trapped and huddled in the dark beneath the suffocating heavy clouds of radioactive ash and weaponized weather systems, was witnessing this catastrophic cosmic breach. But the brilliant occult minds of the shadow government had already entirely anticipated the physical return of the Watchers, and they were actively using the global Blue Beam satellite network to perfectly mask the true, mind-shattering horror of the invasion. The massive, black titanium megastructure, hovering silently in geosynchronous orbit, the terrifying, highly advanced technological abomination they proudly call the Third Temple, was currently operating at absolute maximum, blinding capacity. It was violently and aggressively projecting incredibly massive, hyper-realistic, three-dimensional holograms directly into the lower atmosphere, creating a flawless, beautiful, and completely inescapable ceiling of false miracles over the entire bleeding planet. From my isolated orbital vantage point, I could clearly see the terrified, desperate, and broken survivors falling to their knees in the burning, ruined streets, completely mesmerized by the glowing, majestic, angelic illusions floating in the fake sky. The highly advanced synthetic acoustic weapons were continuously beaming the soothing, deeply hypnotic, and authoritative voice of the false god directly into their fragile minds, promising them eternal peace and miraculous salvation from the chaos. The traumatized people of Earth believe with all their desperate, broken, and bleeding hearts that they are currently witnessing a divine rescue mission, a glorious, holy intervention by the benevolent, righteous armies of heaven. They had absolutely no idea that the glowing, beautiful, mathematically perfect angels they are openly weeping over and actively worshiping are nothing more than projected light, a masterfully crafted, deeply evil military psychological operation. The true angels, the ancient, fallen, and deeply hateful entities of the Enoch Protocol are absolutely not made of soft, comforting, divine light. They are made of consuming darkness, deadly radiation, and unimaginable, paralyzing cosmic terror. I slowly, reluctantly turned my attention back to the massive, aggressively expanding ruptures in the fabric of deep space, the violet light now painfully, blindingly bright, casting incredibly long, distorted shadows across the freezing interior of the Manticore. Through the jagged, bleeding, glowing tears in the fundamental fabric of the universe, I finally saw the very first of the Watchers physically emerging into our reality, and the terrifying sight nearly stopped my failing heart from beating entirely. They possessed absolutely no recognizable human features, no biological symmetry, and no eyes. They were just towering, shifting, impossible masses of dark, light-absorbing energy and impossible geometric shapes that completely defied the natural laws of physics. They were colossal, existing on a scale so massive that it made the Manticore look like a meaningless microscopic grain of sand floating helplessly in the deep ocean, moving with a terrifying, deliberate, and silent grace through the absolute vacuum. As the first massive, incomprehensible entity fully crossed the dimensional threshold, a sudden, blinding spike of raw electromagnetic interference completely overwhelmed my primary communication terminal, instantly wiping out the translated Aramaic text. The heavy, crackling static abruptly cleared, completely replaced by a deep, resonant, and entirely alien frequency that did not translate into spoken words, but directly and forcefully injected pure, unadulterated, screaming terror into my nervous system. It was the psychic, telepathic equivalent of an apex predator locking its cold, dead, merciless eyes onto completely defenseless prey, an ancient, malevolent, and incredibly vast awareness sweeping rapidly across the solar system to claim its new domain. The Project Red Heifer vessels, those genetically perfected, utterly soulless, and mathematically flawless human bodies, secretly grown in the subterranean freezing laboratories of Station 6751, are patiently waiting for them down on Earth. The occult elite of the shadow government are absolutely not trying to fight these cosmic horrors. They have spent centuries building a massive planetary infrastructure, specifically designed to welcome them, to provide them with perfect, physical thrones of flesh. The beautiful, glowing false savior currently broadcasting his hypnotic lies from the orbital third temple is merely the vanguard, the supreme entity tasked specifically with pacifying and blinding the human herd before the true, terrifying masters arrive. I am Captain Arthur Vance, floating entirely alone in the freezing, silent dark, bearing witness to the final, permanent, and bloody unraveling of human history, completely powerless to stop the ancient, cosmic nightmare from consuming us all. The absolute, crushing silence of the freezing command module was suddenly shattered by a sound that I can only describe as the agonizing, prolonged scream of dying metal. The colossal, impossible entity that had just violently torn its way through the very fabric of our physical reality had paused its slow, majestic descent toward the burning atmosphere of Earth. It was entirely faceless, a shifting, towering, geometric nightmare composed entirely of pure, light-absorbing dark matter, yet I could physically feel the crushing, suffocating weight of its total attention perfectly locking onto my fragile vessel. Suddenly, the artificial gravity plating beneath my heavy, frost-covered boots completely and violently inverted, throwing my exhausted body violently against the reinforced ceiling of the observation deck. Every single loose object in the freezing cabin, the emergency ration tins, the heavy diagnostic tablets, the shattered glass from the primary console, began to float in a slow, hypnotic, and deeply terrifying orbital dance around the center of the room. The fundamental laws of terrestrial physics, the comforting, unbreakable mathematical rules that have governed human spaceflight for over a century, were being effortlessly rewritten by the mere presence of this ancient, malevolent consciousness. The freezing air inside the command module instantly dropped by another 20 degrees, causing my desperate, ragged breaths to form thick, heavy clouds of white vapor that hung unnaturally in the zero-gravity environment. The creeping frost that had previously covered the outer bulkheads began to mutate, growing rapidly into sharp, jagged, and highly intricate geometric crystallized structures, that looked horrifyingly similar to the alien shapes shifting within the entity's massive body. I desperately grabbed onto the exposed atmospheric piping running along the ceiling, frantically pulling myself back toward the primary pilot's chair as the gravity generators violently shuddered and sparked in the darkness below me. The deep space telemetry sensors, completely overwhelmed by the sheer, impossible volume of raw multidimensional radiation bleeding from the open cosmic wound, simply gave up, their primary screens turning a solid, glowing, and terrifying shade of blood red. I am not dealing with a hostile alien military force or a rogue, highly advanced artificial intelligence that can be reasoned with, outsmarted, or eventually defeated through conventional, desperate human tactics. I am currently trapped in a tiny, freezing titanium cage with an ancient biblical apex predator, a fallen cosmic architect that views the entire human race not as an enemy, but as a deeply flawed, easily manipulated biological resource. The Project Blue Beam holograms currently blinding the terrified population of Earth, with false glowing angelic visions are nothing more than a colorful, pathetic theater production, compared to the paralyzing, reality-breaking horror floating directly outside my window. The thick, reinforced titanium hull of the Manticore began to groan and compress, producing a deep, low-frequency vibration that bypassed my eardrums entirely and violently rattled the marrow directly inside my freezing bones. The massive, shadowy entity drifting in the void was not actively attacking the ship with conventional energy weapons or kinetic projectiles. It was simply and effortlessly extending its vast, telepathic awareness through the solid metal walls. I tried to swallow the dry, metallic taste of absolute terror building in the back of my throat, my trembling hands frantically trying to manually lock down the ship's rapidly failing life support systems before the atmospheric pressure completely collapsed. But the central computer, the highly advanced, incredibly resilient artificial intelligence designed specifically to survive massive solar flares and catastrophic system failures, began to deeply, horrifyingly, malfunction under the psychic pressure. The soothing, automated female voice of the ship's primary diagnostic program suddenly distorted, her perfectly synthesized, calm tone violently shifting down into a deep, guttural, and highly unnatural register. She was no longer reciting standard oxygen depletion warnings or reciting the failing engine temperatures. She was calmly, methodically reading ancient forgotten lines directly from the translated Enoch Protocol. The corrupted artificial intelligence coldly informed me that the dimensional compromise was absolute, proudly declaring that the designated genetic vessels on Earth were fully prepared and eagerly waiting for the grand, agonizing cosmic harvest. I desperately smashed my frozen fist against the main audio control panel, permanently severing the internal speaker cables in a frantic, panicked attempt to stop the deeply hypnotic, maddening voice from penetrating my fragile, exhausted mind. But the terrifying ancient words did not stop echoing. They simply bypassed the ship's broken audio equipment entirely and began to manifest directly inside the deepest, darkest corners of my own consciousness. The Watcher was actively speaking to me, communicating through an overwhelming, paralyzing flood of incredibly vivid, horrific emotional concepts and dark, flashing visual hallucinations, rather than standard, recognizable human language. I saw incredibly ancient, towering cities constructed entirely of black stones, sinking violently beneath boiling, apocalyptic oceans, their screaming, terrified populations entirely consumed by the very dark entities they foolishly worshipped as divine gods. I saw the deeply classified subterranean laboratories of Station 6751, witnessing the pale, soulless, and mathematically perfect human clones of the Red Heifer Project, slowly opening their black, empty eyes in perfect, horrifying synchronization. The ancient, malevolent consciousness was proudly showing me the absolute, undeniable futility of human resistance, systematically breaking down my psychological defenses by forcing me to witness the sheer, infinite scale of their dark cosmic design. The violent, unpredictable gravitational anomalies inside the Manticore suddenly and abruptly ceased, causing my heavy, bruised body to crash brutally back down into the primary pilot's seat with a sickening, heavy thud. The emergency red strobes illuminating the freezing command module flickered rapidly, casting long, distorted, and highly terrifying shadows that seemed to detach from the walls and move independently across the frost-covered floor. I stared through the thick, heavily cracked glass of the main viewport, my heart pounding violently against my ribs as I realized the colossal, shifting geometric mass of dark matter had completely repositioned itself in the blink of an eye. It was no longer hovering near the massive bleeding violet rupture in deep space. It was now drifting mere meters away from the fragile nose of my ship, entirely blocking out the distant stars and the burning ruined sphere of Earth. The sheer, incomprehensible size of the entity completely filled my entire field of vision, an endlessly shifting, boiling ocean of absolute darkness that seemed to actively consume the very light attempting to reflect off the Manticore's hull. I could clearly see massive, unnatural patterns moving deep within its shadowy structure, terrifying, angular shapes that heavily resembled ancient, forgotten occult symbols slowly rotating in a silent, deeply hypnotic, and maddening rhythm. It is actively studying me, peering directly through the heavy titanium plating and the reinforced glass with an ancient, old, and entirely merciless curiosity, evaluating the last, uncompromised human mind left in the entire solar system. The entity effortlessly projected a new, terrifyingly clear thought directly into my paralyzed mind, a cold, absolute certainty that they have successfully hunted and entirely consumed countless fragile civilizations across the endless, dark void. Humanity is not special. Our tragic, beautiful history is not unique, and our desperate, bloody struggle against the orchestrated apocalypse of the shadow government is nothing more than a brief, mildly amusing anomaly in their eternal, cosmic cycle. The false, lowing savior currently broadcasting from the orbital third temple is preparing the final, irreversible psychological chains, ensuring that humanity will march willingly, even joyfully, straight into the waiting, absolute darkness. I slowly reached for the manual override switch on the primary reactor core, my numb, frozen fingers carefully wrapping around the heavy metal lever that controls the final catastrophic self-destruct sequence of the Manticore. If this ancient, malevolent cosmic nightmare truly wishes to physically breach the hull and personally claim the very last free soul in the void, I will ensure it pays a heavy, radioactive price for crossing the threshold. My frozen fingers firmly gripped the heavy titanium lever of the primary reactor override, the cold metal biting into my skin through the torn fabric of my environmental suit. I pulled it downward with every remaining ounce of my failing strength, listening to the deeply satisfying heavy mechanical click that initiated the catastrophic core meltdown. The Manticore immediately responded, its dying system suddenly surging with a violent, terrifying influx of raw thermal energy, the emergency klaxons screaming their final, deafening warning as the containment fields around the nuclear heart of the vessel began to intentionally collapse. I stared directly into the shifting, absolute darkness of the colossal entity, floating just beyond the cracked glass of the viewport, waiting for the blinding flash of atomic fire that would vaporize my fragile body and deny this ancient nightmare its final human prize. But the blinding flash of absolute destruction never came. The violent trembling of the hull suddenly ceased, and the deafening shriek of the emergency klaxons simply faded into an impossible, suffocating silence. The ancient, malevolent consciousness had effortlessly reached through the solid titanium plating and completely arrested the nuclear cascade, manipulating the fundamental flow of time around the reactor core to freeze the catastrophic explosion at the exact microsecond of critical mass. It wanted me to fully understand my absolute insignificance, to painfully realize that even the ultimate, desperate act of human self-destruction was completely meaningless against an entity that predates the very concept of physical matter. The crushing telepathic pressure inside my mind shifted, violently forcing my attention away from the frozen reactor and projecting a sickeningly clear, real-time vision of the surface of Earth directly into my optical nerves. I watched in paralyzed, breathless horror as the global Blue Beam Network finally initiated the final phase of the Grand Deception, the beautiful, glowing holographic angels hovering above the ruined cities, suddenly and violently dropping their majestic illusions. The terrified masses, who had gathered in their millions to openly worship the false saviors, were suddenly enveloped in a blinding, sickly violet light that descended from the orbital third temple, a massive, coordinated, energetic harvest masquerading as divine ascension. The genetically perfect, soulless husks of the Red Heifer Project were actively rising from the subterranean darkness of Black Site Station 6751, stepping into the violet light to physically receive the descending consciousness of the fallen Watchers. The Shadow Government had successfully delivered the entire human race directly to the cosmic slaughterhouse, willingly traded the souls of billions for a pathetic, fleeting promise of eternal power in the new dark paradigm. I slowly released my grip on the frozen override lever, the bitter realization settling deep into my exhausted bones. Dying in a silent, isolated flash of nuclear fire would be an absolute victory for the architects of this nightmare. They want to extinguish the very last spark of human defiance, to ensure that absolutely no record of their grand cosmic deception survives, to warn whatever fragile civilizations might exist in the distant, uncharted stars. I will not give them the satisfaction of my silence, nor will I surrender my mind to the crushing, hypnotic weight of their ancient telepathy. I will keep the Manticore drifting through the frozen void, utilizing every remaining ounce of auxiliary power to broadcast this truth into the absolute darkness. The Enoch Protocol is no longer a hidden, forbidden prophecy. It is our current, bloody reality, and I am its final, uncompromised witness. This is Captain Arthur Vance, transmitting on all available frequencies. The Watchers have returned. The Earth is fully compromised, but I am still breathing in the freezing dark. End of log.